Here's a shocking revelation. The U.S. government's debt burden is on the brink of surpassing Italy's and Greece's for the first time this century, according to IMF projections. But here's where it gets controversial. While European nations like Italy and Greece are projected to reduce their debt-to-GDP ratios by the end of the decade, the U.S. is expected to see its debt levels climb even higher, reaching a staggering 143.4% of GDP by 2030. This raises a critical question. Is the world's largest economy on an unsustainable fiscal path? Let's dive in. The IMF forecasts that the U.S. budget deficit will remain above 7% of GDP annually until 2030, outpacing all other wealthy nations tracked by the fund. This contrasts sharply with Italy and Greece, which, despite their historical struggles with public debt, including Greece's bailout during the 2010 to 2012 Eurozone crisis, are now tightening their belts and projecting downward debt trajectories. And this is the part most people miss. The U.S., as the issuer of the global reserve currency, has far greater borrowing capacity than European nations, yet its debt-to-GDP ratio is set to outpace theirs. Mahmoud Pradhan, head of global macro at the Amundi Investment Institute, calls this a symbolic moment, emphasizing that perpetual deficits are driving the U.S. debt upward. However, he cautions that Italy's weaker growth outlook means its financial stability remains fragile. James Knightley, a U.S. economist at ING, adds a provocative twist. Many U.S. politicians and investors look down on Europe's slow growth, but these metrics should spark a reevaluation of that perspective. The Biden administration has seen the federal deficit expand rapidly, even with unemployment at record lows. Meanwhile, the Trump administration's efforts to cut spending and raise revenues through tariffs have been met with mixed opinions. Joe Lavorgna, economic counselor to U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, argues that fiscal improvements this year have been overlooked, particularly since April. But is this enough to reverse the trend? While U.S. gross government debt has historically remained below Italy's and Greece's, the net debt measure, which accounts for financial assets, paints a more nuanced picture. Joe Gagnon of the Peterson Institute notes that while the U.S. net debt is still lower than Italy's, it's rising too. By contrast, Italy's net debt is expected to decline from 2028 onward, thanks to its cautious fiscal policies and access to €200 billion in EU pandemic recovery funds. Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni's government has earned praise for reducing Rome's budget deficit, with Italy projected to achieve a primary surplus of 0.9% of GDP this year. This progress has led to a sovereign rating upgrade from DBRS Morningstar, reflecting improved investor confidence. Yet, Italy's GDP growth remains sluggish, with the IMF forecasting just 0.5% growth this year. Here's the real debate. Can the U.S. political landscape ever align to address its mounting deficits? Gagnon highlights the partisan divide. Democrats resist spending cuts, Republicans oppose tax hikes, and neither side seems willing to budge. Maury Obstfeld, former IMF chief economist, warns that any claim of U.S. fiscal sustainability relies on wishful thinking about productivity, tariffs, demographics, or interest rates. So what do you think? Is the U.S. on a dangerous fiscal path, or can it navigate its debt challenges without long-term consequences? Let's hear your thoughts in the comments.